In the mid-18th century, a poltergeist known as Scratching Fanny became the talk of London. Hordes of people, from friends and neighbours all the way up to a prince of the realm, descended on a small house in Cock Lane to see, or rather hear, the ghost for themselves. But eventually, this ghost was exposed as a fraud and became the most famous hoax in England until the Cottingley Fairies more than 150 years later. If you're new here, hi, I'm Juliet. I'm a writer and historian, and this is the story of the Cock Lane Poltergeist. Strange knocking and scratching noises were first reported at the house at Cock Lane in January 1760. This was in the last months of the reign of King George II. His son George III inherited the throne in October of that year. George III is best known by Americans for being the tyrant overthrown by the Revolutionary War, and best known by British people for suffering from severe mental illness later in life. But at this point, in the very early part of his reign, neither of those things had happened yet. He was the first of the King Georges to actually be born and raised in Britain. George I and II had both been born and raised in Germany, or what is now Germany. He became king at only 22 years old. He married his wife Charlotte the following year in 1761, and was at the time the Cock Lane Poltergeist was active, enjoying a very happy marriage and family life. The 18th century in England was the period of the Enlightenment. It was the period of increasing scientific and philosophical research, and it was the period of the Industrial Revolution and growing industry, the very beginnings of modern industry, seeing increasing growth throughout that century. The City of London, both the technical City of London, which is a specific area in London, and Greater London, had seen extensive rebuilding after the Great Fire of 1666, and London was enjoying a period of substantial growth and prosperity, although with that growth did also come increasing problems of poverty. The more people living in a city, the more the class divide grows and poverty increases. In the mid-1700s, just before the Cock Lane Poltergeist started up its activity, London was also being cleared a bit of some of its medieval buildings and streets. Some of the medieval buildings that had survived the fire, that were still clustered close together, wooden buildings very tightly knit on narrow winding streets, were starting to be cleared and replaced with much wider streets and bigger, more modern houses. The house in Cock Lane that was the site of the activity no longer exists, but you can see it in this 19th century illustration. And it is a reasonably modern-looking building for the 18th century, so it is presumably something that has been rebuilt in more recent times, at the time of the haunting. It's not an old medieval building. This would be a relatively modern building in this period. And the ghost itself was said to be a very recent ghost. The woman who supposedly became the Cock Lane ghost was a woman called Fanny Lines. She was from a village in Wiltshire called Lyneham. In the mid-1750s, Fanny had moved in with her sister Elizabeth and Elizabeth's husband, William Kent, while Elizabeth was pregnant. Elizabeth died in childbirth and the baby died a short time later, after which Fanny began a relationship with Elizabeth's widower, William. He was a moneylender. Because William had been married to her sister and because they had had a baby, even though the child had not lived very long, church canon law prevented Fanny and William from getting married. It was considered at that time a form of incest because they were essentially now brother and sister, given that William had had a child with Fanny's sister. That made them brother and sister in the eyes of canon law at the time, even though, of course, they had no blood relation, and sadly the baby had not survived, so there wasn't actually any relationship between them at that point. William and Fanny ended up moving to London and moved into the house on Cock Lane, which they sublet from a parish clerk called Richard Parsons, and where they lived as man and wife. Because they had moved to an area where nobody knew them, they were then able to present themselves as man and wife without having to endure the scandal of living together unmarried. Although later on the ghost would be identified as the ghost of Fanny, the knockings and scratchings in the house actually started while Fanny was still alive. Fanny had become pregnant as well, and William had had to go away for a few days, and he asked his landlord, Richard Parsons' daughter Elizabeth, who was at that time about 10 years old, to share Fanny's bed. This is very common in this period in history. For practical reasons like warmth, as well as security and companionship, it's not unusual for people to share the same bed. So Elizabeth Parsons was sleeping in Fanny's bed when they started hearing these strange knockings and scratching sounds. William and Fanny could not find the source of the strange sounds, so they decided to move out of the house. At this point, William had lent Parsons money in his role as a money lender. He had also let slip to Richard Parsons that he and Fanny were not really married. Sadly, Fanny then died of smallpox while she was still pregnant. This left William alone again, and when he asked Parsons to repay the money he had lent him, Parsons could not pay. At this point, William Kent and Richard Parsons appear to have fallen out. The scratching and knocking noises ceased for about 1.5 years after Fanny's death, during which time William remarried again, and he also managed to get his money back from Parsons, but not without having to take legal action in order to do so. Then the noises returned around December 1761. By this point, Richard Parsons and his family had moved back into the house in Cock Lane themselves, and his 2 young daughters, Elizabeth and her younger sister, Elizabeth is about 12 years old by now, were both sleeping together in one particular room, and this is where the scratching and knocking started up again. Then, as described in the monograph published shortly after these events by Oliver Goldsmith called The Mystery Revealed, containing a series of transactions and authentic testimonials respecting the supposed Cock Lane ghost, which have hitherto been concealed from the public, the eldest child pretended to see the actual ghost of the deceased lady mentioned above. Now, this appears to have been initially identified as Elizabeth Kent, William's first wife. When she had seen the ghost, a weak, ignorant publican also who lived in the neighbourhood, and pub landlord, asserted that he had seen it too. He apparently had quite a reputation for drinking his own products. And Mr. Parsons himself, the gentleman whom Mr. Kent had disobliged by suing for money, he also saw the ghost about the same time. The girl saw it without hands in a shroud. The other 2 saw it with hands, all luminous and shining. So this ghost is appearing in distinctly different ways to different people, but it has apparently appeared to Elizabeth Parsons, to Richard Parsons, and to a drunk pub landlord. At this point, the Parsons seem to be identifying this ghost as Elizabeth Kent, but although they can see it, or they have seen it, it cannot speak. A relative of Parsons called Mary Fraser suggested using a method that had been used to talk to knocking ghosts by religious clerics on a couple of occasions in the 16th century. You go into the room and you ask the ghost questions, and you tell it to reply with 1 knock for yes and 2 knocks for no. By questioning it this way, they apparently established that the ghost was not Elizabeth after all, but Fanny herself, and that William Kent had poisoned her for her money, because nearly all of her money had been left to her common-law husband/brother-in-law in her will. The ghost also, in yes-no responses to questions, explained that she wanted to see him hanged. This, of course, means they must have directly asked the ghost, "Do you want him to be hanged?" in order for the ghost to say yes, since this is entirely a conversation where the Parsons are asking questions and the ghost is knocking to answer yes or no. In January 1762, the newspaper The Public Ledger reported that Fanny Lyons had been lured to London, imprisoned and murdered by poisoning. And a few days later, the newspaper revealed that the source of this information was Fanny's ghost. As a result, crowds started to flock to Cock Lane to experience it for themselves. The experience is described in The Mystery Revealed. To have a proper idea of this scene as it is now carried on, the reader is to conceive a very small room with a bed in the middle. The girl, at the usual hour of going to bed, is undressed and put in with proper solemnity. The spectators are next introduced, who sit looking at each other, suppressing laughter, and wait in silent expectation for the opening of the scene. As the ghost is a good deal offended at incredulity, the persons present are to conceal theirs, if they have any, as by this concealment they can only hope to gratify their curiosity. For if they show, either before or when the knocking is begun, a too prying, inquisitive, or ludicrous turn of thinking, the ghost continues usually silent, or, to use the expression of the house, Miss Fanny is angry. The spectators therefore have nothing for it but to sit quiet and credulous, otherwise they must hear no ghost, which is no small disappointment to persons who have come for no other purpose. The girl, who knows by some secret when the ghost is to appear, sometimes apprises the assistants of its intended visitation. It first begins to scratch, and then to answer questions, giving 2 knocks for a negative and 1 for an affirmative. It is sometimes mistaken in questions of a private nature when it deigns to answer them. For instance, she called her father John instead of Thomas, a mistake indeed a little extraordinary in a ghost. However, though sometimes right and sometimes wrong, she pretty invariably persists in one story, namely that she was poisoned in a cup of pearl by red arsenic, a poison unheard of before, by Mr. Kent in her last illness, and that she heartily wishes him hanged. Horace Walpole went to visit Cock Lane with a group of friends, including the King's brother, the Duke of York, whose presence got them squeezed in despite the crowds already there. They went after a night out at the opera, and you have to wonder how much they'd already had to drink at this point, and they treated it as a sort of evening's entertainment. Walpole afterwards wrote to his friend George Montague, "A drunken parish clerk set it on foot out of revenge. The Methodists have adopted it, and the whole town of London think of nothing else." The drunken parish clerk being Richard Parsons, who had a reputation as a drunkard and an alcoholic already before all this started. Walpole told Montague, "I went to hear it, for it is not an apparition, but an audition." Clearly, by this point, nobody is expecting to actually see the ghost, despite the apparent visions of it that had been seen earlier. Walpole continues, "It rained torrents, yet the lane was full of mob, and the house so full we could not get in. At last they discovered it was the Duke of York, and the company squeezed themselves into one another's pockets to make room for us. The house, which is borrowed, and to which the ghost has adjourned, is wretchedly small and miserable. When we opened the chamber, in which we were 50 people with no light but one tallow candle at the end, we tumbled over the bed of the child to whom the ghost comes, and whom they are murdering there by inches in such insufferable heat and stench. At the top of the room are ropes to dry clothes. I asked if we were to have rope dancing between the acts. We had nothing. They told us, as they would at a puppet show, that it would not come that night till 7 in the morning, that is, when there are only prentices and old women. We stayed, however, till half an hour after 1. The Methodists have promised them contributions. Provisions are set in like forage, and all the taverns and alehouses in the neighbourhood make fortunes. The most diverting part is to hear people wondering when it will be found out, as if there was anything to find out, as if the actors would make their noises where they can be discovered. However, this pantomime cannot last much longer. We can see in this story elements that will recur in poltergeist stories in all the years since. We have a young girl, 10 to 12 years old. We have knocking and rapping noises. The idea of poltergeists attaching themselves to young girls has become an idea with incredible sticking power over the years. Whether it is partly because of this early story that has become such a feature is hard to say. You can hear from both Oliver Goldsmith and Horace Walpole the absolute skepticism. They do not believe in this ghost at all. They are convinced that it is a fake already. But Walpole did mention the Methodists, who were less inclined to immediate skepticism. One of the men who came to examine the ghost from about December 1761 was John Moore, an Anglican clergyman but very sympathetic to the new dissenting Methodist Church. Methodism was founded in the 1730s in both Wales and England. It was a Protestant church that broke away, or dissented in the language of the time, from the Church of England. Methodists tended towards belief in the supernatural. They were not the only ones. There was a general tendency among priests and clerics and religious people in this period to quite often defend the existence of spirits in general, including ghosts, against the ideas of the Enlightenment that were starting to reject belief in ghosts and spirits. So Catholic clergy often defended the idea of ghosts and spirits as well. Anglicans a little bit more divided, going back to the Protestant ideas of the Reformation, where the Catholic idea of purgatory was rejected. Some Protestant churches, like the Anglican Church, were more inclined to say that when you die, you either go to heaven or hell, and that's it. There's no in-between, so there's no ghosts. Medieval Catholics often conceived of ghosts as spirits that had escaped or been temporarily allowed out of purgatory, the in-between stage where you are punished for your sins before you can get into heaven. That's a specifically Catholic belief. Methodists do not believe in purgatory. They are a Protestant denomination, but Methodism did tend toward quite a strong belief in spirits and ghosts and various elements of the supernatural. We can also see in these reports the description of what would eventually become the format of the 19th century séance. Séances proper are really kicked off by the rise of the spiritualist movement in America and by another knocking and rapping ghost, again from America in the mid-19th century, that communicated in this same way, again with young girls, Kate and Margaret Fox, in Hydesville, New York in 1847. There's more about that in my video on 19th century witchcraft, where I covered spiritualism and séances in quite a bit of detail, but this case is obviously an early example of the same thing, And we know that there are also instances from 2 centuries earlier where clergymen had used the same method to try and question ghosts. Part of the reason for the widespread skepticism about ghosts, aside from simply the rise of the scientific method and the ideas of the Enlightenment in general, that went hand in hand with a more specific reason, which is that ghosts were often lumped together with witches and witchcraft as a form of superstition. By the 18th century, this is after the period of the witch trials in most places. There are places in Eastern Europe where witch trials continued into the 18th century, but the intense period of the prosecution of people for witchcraft in Western Europe was predominantly the 17th century and the 16th as well. Particularly in England, most of the witch trials, including the biggest, which was the one led by Matthew Hopkins, the self-styled Witchfinder General, had happened in the 17th century. By the 1700s, mass executions of people for witchcraft in Britain had ended. The British Witchcraft Act of 1735 was actually designed to stop people being convicted of witchcraft. It had been set up on the presumption that, in fact, there were no witches, that witchcraft was not real, and that anybody claiming to be a witch was in fact committing a form of fraud. And that is what the Witchcraft Act of 1735 prosecutes, and what some people famously were prosecuted under all the way up to the mid-20th century, when the last 2 people to be prosecuted under the Act were Helen Duncan and Jane Rebecca York. This was an important development, the sort of thing that people being accused of in the witch trials of the 17th century were not actually related to the real practice of witchcraft. There were plenty of people practicing witchcraft across Europe, including Britain, all the way up to the 20th century, and indeed there still are. During the early modern period, they were primarily known as cunning folk, and they would provide amulets and spells and cures and all sorts of things. But the people prosecuted in the witch trials were not being accused primarily of that, although cunning folk were vulnerable to accusations of witchcraft. The accusations in the witch trials were lurid stories about dancing with the devil and having intimate relations with the devil or with demons and having demon familiars and getting together to have parties with the devil and all this kind of thing. There's very little evidence for anything like that ever occurring in real life. So, eventually, as people realised that people were being executed for something that simply wasn't true, mostly because they had had confessions tortured out of them, the tide of popular opinion turned against the idea of witchcraft in general, because the things people had been accused of in the witch trials were patently ridiculous and not true. Ghosts then also often got lumped together with witches, so there was a widespread feeling of general skepticism concerning both ghosts and witches. One of the founders of Methodism, John Wesley, had put them together as witches and apparitions in discussing them in one of his texts. One of the pamphlets about the haunting in Cock Lane that came out on the side of skepticism, as most of them did, was called Anti-Canidia, or Superstition Detected and Exposed. Canidia is a famous character from some ancient Roman poems by a poet called Horace, and she is a witch. So the pamphlet, which takes a sceptical attitude to the Cock Lane Poltergeist, is titled essentially Anti-Witchcraft. We can also see how belief in ghosts and belief in witchcraft are lumped together in this satirical engraving by the famous satirist William Hogarth. This engraving is called Credulity, Superstition and Fanaticism, a Medley, by Hogarth in 1762. It was reworked from an original called Enthusiasm Delineated. I'm not going to go through absolutely everything in this engraving because there's a lot of detail here, but I'll pick out some of the main things. It shows several famous supernatural frauds, and the preacher is reading from a book that says, "I speak as a fool." The pause box is empty because of the emphasis on faith alone rather than good works that appears in dissenting religions like Methodism. So this seems to be predominantly a sort of anti-Methodist satire, and it has been reworked from an original which already had the cleric and the pulpit and so on. So it's probably something that is taking its beginning as being anti-Methodist, and then the events around Cock Lane have caused it to be retitled and reworked a bit, but you can still see the strong kind of anti-Methodism in it. The Cock Lane Poltergeist is represented as a ghost holding a hammer at the top of a thermometer registering enthusiasm. Another famous poltergeist, the drummer of Tedworth from the 1600s, can be seen at the top of the thermometer. The woman lying on the floor surrounded by rabbits is Mary Toft, who carried out a famous hoax in the 1720s when she claimed to have given birth to various animal parts after seeing and becoming fascinated by a rabbit. The three figures around the pulpit are another three famous ghosts. Sir George Villiers, whose ghost supposedly tried to warn a servant to warn his son of the same name, the boyfriend of the late King James I, that he was about to be murdered. Unsuccessfully, sadly. Then the ghost of Julius Caesar appearing to the assassin Brutus, as in Shakespeare's play. In actual history, according to Plutarch, it was Brutus's own evil spirit, his kakos daimon, that appeared to Brutus shortly before his final defeat in battle. But in Shakespeare's play, Shakespeare made it the ghost of Julius Caesar himself, and that's the version we see here. And the third is the ghost of Mrs. Veal, the subject of a popular broadside ghost story from 1705. By Daniel Defoe. There are also numerous references to the previous century's witch trials, including a witch on a broomstick and a copy of King James I and VI's Demonology. He's King James VI of Scotland and I of England, and the book Demonology was a book he wrote about how to discover witches. James felt very strongly about witches because he thought that a conspiracy of witches had been trying to murder him in the 1590s. Hogarth was not the only artist who produced satirical works on the subject of the Cock Lane Poltergeist. This one is called English Credulity, or The Invisible Ghost. The print compares the Cock Lane ghost to two other recent, at that time, notorious frauds. The Bottle Conjurer was a theatrical act where the conjurer was supposed to magically go into a bottle on stage and then sing from it, but the conjurer himself never showed up to do it. Elizabeth Canning claimed to have been kidnapped and kept locked in a room without food for 27 days, and that she had been sustained by heavenly spirits. She was later put on trial for perjury, on the grounds that nobody can survive without food for 27 days. This third one is called the Cock Lane Uproar. It advertises Miss Fanny's New Theatre, an entertainment of scratching and knocking in 2 acts on the left-hand side. The right-hand side shows the investigating committee who decided to try to prove or disprove the ghost's existence. During this period of the Enlightenment, people were developing the scientific method, the idea that you come up with a hypothesis and then you test it in order to prove or disprove it. This was a pretty recent idea at the time. The investigating committee were a group of men put together to try to put the Cock Lane ghost to some kind of scientific test. It was organised by Stephen Aldrich, an Anglican priest who did not like Methodism. The committee was made up of various people in positions of authority. The matron of a local lying-in hospital, who was also representing women in general, Bishop John Douglas, Dr. George Macaulay, Captain Wilkinson, James Penn, John Moore, and Samuel Johnson, the man who produced the first dictionary of the English language in 1755, brilliantly played by Robbie Coltrane in Blackadder III. Dr. Johnson described the experiment. The supposed spirit had before publicly promised by an affirmative knock that it would attend one of the gentlemen into the vault under the church of St. John, Clerkenwell, where the body is deposited. That's Fanny's body, assuming that the ghost is the ghost of Fanny. And it would give a token of her presence there by a knock upon her coffin. It was therefore determined to make this trial of the existence or veracity of the supposed spirit. The company at 1 o'clock went into the church, and the gentleman to whom the promise was made went with another into the vault. The spirit was solemnly required to perform its promise, but nothing more than silence ensued. The person supposed to be accused by the spirit, William Kent, then went down with several others, but no effect was perceived. It is therefore the opinion of the whole assembly that the child has some art of making or counterfeiting a particular noise, and that there is no agency of any higher cause. So the investigating committee concluded fairly firmly that Elizabeth Parsons was responsible for the knocking and scratching sounds, and that there was no ghost. By this point, William Kent had been accused of murder because of this haunting, so it was really quite serious and quite important that they establish what was actually going on and clear the poor man's name. Luckily for William Kent, on the 21st of February 1762, a wooden block used to make knocking and scratching sounds was found in Elizabeth Parsons' bed. Given that the first knocking and scratching sounds were heard when Elizabeth was sharing a bed with Fanny while Fanny was still alive, and the Parsons couldn't even agree on exactly who the ghost was, this was not surprising. The following year, in January 1763, Richard Parsons was sentenced to 2 years in prison, and he had to stand in the pillory 3 times. Mary Fraser was given 6 months in prison. While Parsons was in the pillory, the crowd took a collection for him, because despite the fact that the hoax had been revealed, there was still a lot of people believing in the Cock Lane ghost and sympathising with Parsons. Even in the 19th century, the folklorist and scholar Andrew Lang was not so convinced that it was all a hoax, based on the fact the weird noises started while Fanny was still living in the house. Lang was essentially suggesting that the ghost wasn't Fanny, but also that it wasn't a hoax. However, just about everybody else considers it one of the clearest examples of a hoax in English ghost history, and it's gone down in history as kind of a byword for fraud. So that is the story of the Cock Lane Poltergeist. What do you think? Do you think there might have really been a ghost? You wouldn't be completely alone. Andrew Lang certainly thought so. He thought that the proofs provided to prove it was a hoax were not convincing. He is largely alone in that, though. You'll be glad to hear that William Kent was also, of course, exonerated. If you enjoyed this video, please do give it a like. If you would like to support the channel and you enjoy historical ghost stories, you might want to buy my book. Creepy Classics, Ghost Stories from Ancient Rome, retells 13 ancient Roman ghost stories in a modern format. There's also an author's note at the back, and each story tells you exactly which text it comes from. And it includes the original version, or a retelling of the original version of the story of Brutus seeing the evil spirit. That one is called The Fault in Ourselves, which I did steal from Shakespeare, obviously. But that story is retold from Plutarch in here. Of course, you can also read Plutarch, which is freely available online if you would like to see the original version of that story before Shakespeare messed with it. Until next time, bye! And for anyone wondering how the puppy is doing, here he is, running around enthusiastically in the garden. He's not yet staying with me while I film videos because he hasn't yet quite got the hang of sitting quietly while I do some filming. But he is enjoying exploring the garden, and he's even getting used to walking on his lead now, so he's doing really well.